It is often said that history is written by the victors, meaning that those who emerge triumphant in not just military struggles, but cultural, social, and religious contests are able to lay the formative narratives that become the default perspective and shape conventional wisdom. Though something of a cliché in modern contexts, we must remember that in the Roman world, this was often literally the case. For example, the great general Hannibal Barca is the most famous son of Carthage because of the attention that he receives in Roman sources. For after the destruction of that once magnificent city in the Third Punic War, all that remained of Carthaginian literature was a single agricultural manual that was deemed sufficiently apolitical enough to merit preservation. Everything else, every piece of Carthaginian poetry, every history, every religious text, burned with the city. Saint Jerome may have been exaggerating when he said that the whole world perished in one city after the sack of Rome in 410, but this was an appropriate way to describe the annihilation of Carthage. The Romans had stamped out not just a city, but a people and a civilization. This act of genocide was a moment of transition for the Republic, as it stepped into its new role as the hegemon of the Mediterranean. Its echo was still being felt centuries later, when the Augustan poet and propagandist Virgil attempted to justify the destruction of Carthage by placing a quote in the mouth of their mythical queen Dido, describing why the Carthaginians bore such hatred for Rome. "Let there be no love or treaties between our peoples. Rise, some unknown avenger, from my dust, who will pursue the Trojan colonists with fire and sword, now or in time to come, whenever the strength is granted him. I pray that shore be opposed to shore, water to wave, weapon to weapon. Let them fight, them and their descendants." Even after their deaths, the Carthaginians could not be permitted to speak for themselves. Augustus, like his adoptive father Julius Caesar, was conscious of the need to shape perceptions in the present so that future historians would remember his career fondly, and the legitimacy of his new monarchical order that subverted so many core tenets of the Republic would endure. He had triumphed over countless foes to assume sole power over Rome, and as victor intended to write the official histories of his era. The Aeneid was just one aspect of this strategy, and Virgil's epic actually comes off as subtle in comparison to the Res Gestae Divi Augusti, the princeps' official account of his career and accomplishments. That this lengthy document was inscribed across the empire outside of temples dedicated to the imperial cult, and that the English translation of its title is The Deeds of the Divine Augustus, helps to illustrate both the grandiosity of the work and Augustus's inflated perception of himself. One of the central claims that Augustus makes in the Res Gestae is that he had restored peace to the empire, healing internal divisions but also receiving the submission of outsiders, particularly the Parthians. "From Spain, Gaul, and the Dalmatians I recovered, after conquering the enemy, many military standards which had been lost by other generals. The Parthians I compelled to restore to me the spoils and standards of 3 Roman armies, and to seek as suppliants the friendship of the Roman people." We can see clearly that Augustus was hoping to reframe decades of setbacks on the Eastern Front and the Roman inability to conquer Parthia by making it appear that he had achieved victory without resorting to military force, when, in reality, he had struck a diplomatic bargain that treated the two states as equals. Thus, his claims of Parthian submission were highly exaggerated, but since he was providing the official version of history, it was his account which was remembered, and still lingers, even today. Such is the power of Roman narratives, that even as scholarship shifts understanding of the Roman civilization away from uncritical veneration of its great men, they are still often treated as the protagonists of their era, if only because outside perspectives are few and far between. By necessity, almost all of the content on this channel has thus largely been forced to abide by Roman framing, with Roman figures often taking center stage, even as we seek to bring a critical eye to Rome and its practices. Nowhere is this more apparent than in the video on Caesar's genocide in Gaul, where our primary source isn't just Roman, but the pen of Caesar himself. Try as we might to center the Gauls in this narrative, we are still incredibly reliant on Caesar. The victor has written our history, and we should not be surprised that he comes off looking rather good in it. However, the imbalanced relationship between Rome and its neighbors in our sources switches abruptly, and quite dramatically in the middle of the 3rd century, during Rome's conflict with Sassanid Persia, and the shortcomings are particularly evident as we attempt to reconstruct the invasion of Persia led by Gordian III in 242, against the Sassanid King of Kings, Shapur I, in retaliation for previous incursions into Roman territory. For large portions of this war, our main Latin accounts are a few brief paragraphs from Aurelius Victor and Eutropius, as well as a more detailed survey in the famously unreliable Historia Augusta, all of which were written in the 4th century. Their faults as sources are obvious, as key events such as the death of Gordian III in Persia remain shrouded in mystery and competing narratives. Did the young emperor perish from natural causes while on campaign? Was he killed in battle with the Persians? Or was it scheming by the Praetorian prefect, Philip the Arab, the man who succeeded him as emperor, which ultimately proved to be his undoing? Unfortunately, we are left with more questions than answers. Due to the paucity of our sources, even something as seemingly cut and dry as the decisive battle of the war itself remains unclear. Fortunately, we also have the Persian accounts, and while these must be treated with the same skepticism as all ancient sources, they possess a higher degree of plausibility, consistency, and coherence. As the empire's fortunes ebbed, so too apparently did its ability to establish the truths according to which history would be written. Vae victis, indeed. If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support. From what we can tell, Roman forces commanded by Timesitheus, Gordian's father-in-law and Praetorian prefect, initially seem to have scored a great, albeit not decisive victory against the Persians at Rassena in 243. But shortly after this, the competent and loyal Timesitheus, who had in effect been running the Roman state as regent, owing to Gordian's youth and inexperience, died. Apparently of disease, but suspicions lingered on Philip the Arab, who soon stepped into the now vacated role of Praetorian prefect. With their most capable general dead, the offensive was halted at the Battle of Meshech in 244. But, due to contradictions in our sources, we cannot state with certainty how significant the defeat was. What we do know is that Gordian would soon be dead, either from disease, injuries sustained in the battle, or the machinations of Philip, who ascended to the throne and, as the new emperor, ceded Roman claims to Mesopotamia and agreed to pay an indemnity to Shapur so that the legions would be allowed to retreat. In official proclamations, Philip treated this as a routine peace treaty, but Shapur was less diplomatic. To him, this was a remarkable victory, and one he would trumpet to undergird the legitimacy of his new dynasty. As such, it featured prominently in a massive carved relief that broadcast Shapur's achievements, a monument not terribly dissimilar from Augustus's Res Gestae. When at first we had become established in the empire, Gordian Caesar raised in all of the Roman Empire a force from the Goth and German realms and marched on Babylonia against the Empire of Iran and against us. On the border of Babylonia at Meshech, a great frontal battle occurred. Gordian Caesar was killed, and the Roman force was destroyed, and the Romans made Philip Caesar. Then Philip Caesar came to us for terms, and, to ransom their lives, gave us 500,000 dinars, and became tributary to us. So, in contrast to the Roman sources that omit the Battle of Meshech entirely, Shapur claims it as a massive victory that even resulted in the death of a Roman emperor. In commemoration of his triumph, Shapur renamed the location Peraz Sapur, meaning victorious is Shapur. Like his Roman counterparts, establishing a lasting narrative was clearly of paramount importance to Shapur as well. Underscoring this, his Res Gestae depicts Gordian being trampled under Shapur's horse, visually reinforcing the Persian claim of total victory, and making the message apparent to anyone who didn't speak one of the three languages in which the text had been written. This Persian narrative thus directly contradicts the Roman version, prompting many to wonder if there was obfuscation on the part of Philip as he sought to cover up the devastating military defeat, as well as any role he may have played in Gordian's death. Philip was incentivized to spin the official narrative as the legitimacy of his claim was derived entirely from his appointment as Praetorian prefect by Gordian, meaning the campaign against Persia had to have ended in success. For this reason, he was eager to tout the treaty with Shapur as one between equals. To further distance himself from any rumors that he had usurped the throne, Philip buried Gordian with full honors and had him deified. Meshech was Shapur's first significant triumph over the Romans, but it would not be his last. Over the next 3 decades, he would establish himself as a thorn in the side of an empire so riven by internal disunity that it could ill afford sustained conflict on its eastern frontier. Though Shapur was certainly competent, his effectiveness as both a ruler and as a military commander owed to key structural factors that left Sassanian Persia better positioned for success in this new era. We must recall that his dynasty was relatively new, and a product of domestic turmoil that parallels the unrest which had been occurring in Rome. Shapur's father Ardashir had recognized the weakness of the old Parthian regime, which allowed great autonomy for regional rulers who were able to govern their own fiefdoms as quasi-independent power centers. Ardashir had once been one of these rulers and sought to prevent a competitor from emulating his rise to power by centralizing authority. The change was substantial, as, though it aligned with emergent conditions, it still countered prevailing cultural mores. Winning support for the new regime required shows of strength, demonstrating that Ardashir and Shapur had legitimacy as rulers. Victories over Rome were therefore useful primarily as contests for prestige and status, more than they were efforts to conquer Rome itself. In contrast to the newfound order in Persia that more closely aligned the affairs of state with political and economic realities, Roman government in practice was becoming fundamentally misaligned with its socio-economic base. Though a full discussion of this process of drift could make up an entire video, and probably will at some point, we will focus here on how it most clearly manifested, which was in the military anarchy that had severed the legions from society at large and made the army a state within the state. As political and military institutions became anachronistic, contradictory, and increasingly predatory, a new ruling elite of military strongmen emerged as the 3rd century's key power players. These men had risen through the ranks of the military and, though wealthy by the time they reached the throne, were often at odds with the traditional landowning base, fomenting further disunity. Due to their recent reorganizations, the Sassanids were thus better equipped to confront Rome without worrying about internal divisions. This gave Shapur an incredible advantage over the Roman commanders he faced, who were forced to divide resources and constantly assess other generals as potential internal threats. So even though he lacks the name recognition of Hannibal, Shapur was the first opposing commander to score repeated victories over the legions on this scale since the great Carthaginian general. Shapur may not have been as innovative a tactician as Hannibal, but he was much more keenly aware of Rome's structural weaknesses, as well as his own, something that proved just as important to his success. He displayed a knack for preying on the Romans when they were most vulnerable. This was, of course, eased dramatically by the challenges Rome faced independent of him, but Shapur was wise enough to leverage Roman disorder at the opportune moments, and to avoid pressing his luck. For example, years after Meshech, Shapur would take advantage of Rome's preoccupation with Gothic incursions to lead an invasion that struck deep into Syria, culminating in the sack of Antioch, the empire's third largest city, in 256. This resulted in over 100,000 people being led back to Persia, destined for a life of slavery under the King of Kings. It is difficult to overstate just how seismic this blow was to Roman power and prestige, signifying that even its greatest cities were vulnerable. Shapur, of course, knew that Roman honor demanded vengeance, and that a punitive expedition would arrive once the imperial war machine was able to mobilize. But instead of humbling the Persians, the retaliatory invasion led by the Emperor Valerian instead resulted in his capture at the Battle of Edessa in 260. Rome had already endured the humiliation of seeing Emperor Decius slain by Goths in 251. Now, just 10 years later, Rome's fortunes had reached a new nadir. Their former sovereign was a prisoner in Persia, with Shapur allegedly using the captive emperor as a lowly footstool for mounting his horse. Valerian's son Gallienus succeeded his father, but was powerless to free him. For a culture that placed such an enormous value on the duty of children towards their parents, the inability of the most powerful man in the empire to relieve his own father from misery and indignity was a symbol of Rome's fading capabilities. A society that could not protect even the emperor seemed fated to wither and collapse. Indeed, Shapur's repeated victories caused those in the east to question if they could really look to far-off Rome for their safety, and sustained success against the Persians would only occur at the hands of the Palmyrene general Odenathus, who, though nominally loyal to Rome, was carving out an increasingly independent realm that would eventually break away. The end seemed near. A Roman, seeing the burnt-out shell of Antioch after Shapur's sack of the city, must have wondered if the empire itself was on borrowed time, and perhaps even considered Scipio Aemilianus's prophecy at the destruction of Carthage. Scipio, beholding this city, which had flourished 700 years from its foundation, and had ruled over so many lands, islands, and seas, rich with arms and fleets, elephants and money, equal to the mightiest monarchies but far surpassing them in bravery and high spirit, since without ships or arms, and in the face of famine, it had sustained continuous war for 3 years, now come to its end in total destruction. Scipio, beholding this spectacle, is said to have shed tears and publicly lamented the fortune of the enemy. After meditating by himself for a long time and reflecting on the rise and fall of cities, nations, and empires, as well as of individuals, upon the fate of Troy, that once proud city, upon that of the Assyrians, the Medes, and the Persians, greatest of all, and, later, the splendid Macedonian Empire. Either voluntarily or otherwise, the words of the poet escaped his lips. The day shall come in which our sacred Troy, and Priam, and the people over whom spear-bearing Priam rules, shall perish all. Being asked by Polybius in familiar conversation, for Polybius had been his tutor, what he meant by using these words, he said that he did not hesitate frankly to name his own country, for whose fate he feared when he considered the mutability of human affairs. Rome's misery in the east had provoked nightmares of Shapur that haunted their imaginations like no figure since Hannibal. But unlike the Carthaginian, he survived to tell the tale, and established himself as an author of history on his own terms. So, while the Hannibal comparison is natural, that again unduly centers Rome, and only gives the men identity as opponents of the Romans. Rather, a more accurate parallel for Shapur in my mind is Augustus. Counterintuitive as it may initially seem, the life's work of each was the protection of recently established political orders and dynasties. In addition, each also was sure that they had left an unequaled mark on history that would be celebrated for all time. But as influential as the men were, both Rome and Sassanid Persia have long since faded, and the great monuments they erected to themselves are steadily lost to decay and entropy, a final vindication of Scipio Aemilianus's prescient understanding that the end eventually comes for all of us. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair.